All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome to our final webinar of the series. It's been an interesting adventure and lots of great information along the way. And I hope our attendees have been able to attend maybe more than one. I know several of you have. So thanks for being here. Today we have a pair of speakers, and they're going to sort out who's going to say what when. And I will gladly let them do that. But I'd like to, before I introduce them, just mention one more time that we are really grateful to the sponsors that have contributed to make this webinar series happen. Ashton Engineering, the City of Moline, Mark Schwiebert Fund for Environmental Studies, Big River Magazine, and the Nature Conservancy. I'm Carol Downey, I'm with River Action, and I suppose we are the presenting sponsor, if you want to look at it that way. Today we have, as I said, two speakers. Kirsten Wallace, and she is from the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association. And Kirsten is the executive director for that organization. It's a mouthful, I'm not going to say it again. The association is a five-state interstate organization formed by the governors of Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, and Wisconsin to coordinate the state's river-related programs and policies and work with the federal agencies that have river responsibilities. In her position, she develops regional positions, advocates for states' collective interests before Congress and the federal agencies, and facilitates and fosters interagency coordination, cooperation, and communication. Our other speaker is Paul St. Louis, and he is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Paul's a certified floodplain manager, and he's worked for the Rock Island District for the past 10 years. He has experience in planning, constructing, permitting civil works projects, and managing flood risk. Let's see, he joined the construction branch in 2010, and that was followed by the district's emergency management division in 2013 and the project management division in 2019. He earned his associate degree in civil engineering technologies and Bachelor of Science degree in construction management from Michigan Technological University. Paul was awarded a master's in infrastructure planning with an emphasis on floodplain management from the University of Washington, Seattle. So, and today they're going to talk to us about opportunities to build resilience. With that, I will turn it over to our speakers. Oh, one other note, you can type in questions along the way in the Q&A chat window, which should be on the right side of your viewing screen. Okay, I'm done.
Great, Carol. Thanks for putting us on the agenda, giving us time to talk with you all, and thanks for joining this afternoon to listen as Paul and I talk about this project, how it's unfolded, and where we might intend to go with this project. We know that this work is of interest to a lot of folks, especially those along the river who are directly affected by it and feel the consequences of this work. So we're just going to get in it. We've got a lot to talk about today. So how we're going to lay it out, just talk about our agreement right now. The states through UMRBA have a planning assistance to the states agreement with the Corps. So what is that? What was the state's proposal behind that? How did we get to that point where we decided to get into this agreement? And what has been the work done over the last 2 years under that Planning Assistance to the States Agreement, PAS for short. And then as a product of that work, we've put together a report that details the recommendations, mostly of which we have developed alongside of stakeholders or along with stakeholders like many of you who've joined this call and others. So we want to give a little preview of what is in that report, which we will be distributing for review soon, and then next steps for UMRBA in this work. So events leading up to the PAS, Planning Assistance to the States, we, as you know, have seen several years of major events, some atypical, some more routine, but maybe more frequent, of flooding, drought, and sedimentation that's filled in our backwaters in our channel, the navigation channel, that is. In 2016, because of those events, UMRBA put together a planning request with the Corps. It's called Section 729 Authority, which we will get into later in this presentation. But as a part to move that forward, we wanted to see where our stakeholders were at, how they might want to see a plan if that was what stakeholders wanted and thought was reasonable. What would be in that plan, but what else might be needed? What else would be missing that we need to think about? So we held a summit in 2017, and we will go over those outcomes later, but it shaped then our planning assistance to the state's request and agreement. So that's how we'll go over these things in a little bit more detail. We're not going to get into detail about the flooding and drought and sediment that's occurred. A lot of the presentations that you all have heard in the lead up to the river conference have been about that, and there's a lot of different knowledge sources about that. So we're just going to talk about our project today. So in 2017, again, we held a summit of different stakeholders. We had a broad distribution list. In the end, we had over 100 people attend. I believe about 100 people attend from different stakeholder groups, levee groups, conservation groups, navigation, local communities, local municipalities, as well as state and federal agencies. And what we did, you'll see in that in the background, there's a bigger watershed map. And so actually this slide gives a better picture. And what we wanted to do was orient people with respect to the problems and the opportunities that are faced within the watershed, and really get this sense that we're all in this kind of together. We're all in this watershed. We're all in this floodplain. We're thinking about how the watershed is feeding the floodplain, how the floodplain is a product of what the watershed is sending to it, and how we think long term about how the floodplain it will be managed to be able to handle the increasing volume and rate that water and sediment is coming into the system. So with that, we had a day set on opportunities, and a day set on opportunities and challenges, I guess, and then a day on solutions and where we go. What do we do about the work ahead of us? Where should we go? So that's what I'm going to talk about here, the outcomes, the recommendations. It was very interesting at that summit. We had brought together folks who typically disagree, or maybe disagree in terms of other kind of details, but didn't quite know when they came into that summit that they would leave with a common set of recommendations. But they did, and one would be to develop a systemic plan, a plan from the Twin Cities down to the Ohio River confluence, also the Illinois waterway, and that had a series of things inside there, a series of questions that we would address, including how do we manage sediment that's coming into the river, that's going into the backwaters, and how does that affect conveyance? So detailed kind of things like that, but also, some more broader things. There is also this recognition that we do have information, knowledge, we can improve that, but we also can better utilize what we have, bring together different data sources, understand and maybe make some better predictions about how different tributaries will affect the system and how precipitation changes are affecting different tributaries, that kind of stuff. There's also this notion or idea that we need a regional coordination forum specifically about flood issues, drought, sediment, that brings together all the stakeholders and keeps that together. Stakeholders at this summit brought the idea of a governing body, but there's a lot of questions about what that would do or how that would act. Also, resolution to policy impediments and fiscal resource needs, so to concentrate on that. So that brought the states, to recognize that commonality and that direction to the states and to the Corps to figure this out and to develop that systemic plan. So, when the states, at least, and I think we can speak for the Corps without crossing a line into advocacy, but that we share this idea that we know that the watershed is feeding the tribute or feeding the river in a different kind of a way, and that we need to look forward and build resilience into the system. So long term, and all this should fit within this goal of resilience planning to formulate solutions within a watershed context, whether that is removal of sediment or preparing, forecasting, and integrating assumptions related to land use changes. So different things like that. Those are just two, examples. And then it ensures solutions are doable and durable, so that we can actually accomplish these things and that they can last a long time. So we want to do that through a coordinated network of public agencies and affected interests. We know we need a common vision, a common talking point that we can all, kind of gather around and put all of our actions towards, and improve knowledge and use that information as we had talked about. So one of the things we recognized is that it's not so much of just knowledge or finding that right solution, but it's a social element too. And some of that social element has challenged us to being able to find and implement solutions in the past. And so instead of doing something like typical government agencies might do and develop a plan and then share that for public comment, we want to change that game and be honest with our stakeholders and involve our stakeholders, especially those that are affected, because they should be part of the planning. They should be part of the solutions. So we held a workshop in 2018, a communications workshop that's tailored to SDIC. So that's short for Systematic Development of Informed Consent. So that title speaks for itself. We want to be conscious about how we're developing informed consent. We want to constantly develop that, whether that's informed consent for the meetings that we're holding, the way we lay out a planning approach, what's in that plan, and ultimately then the solutions. So hopefully throughout the way, by buying into and consenting towards the process and the solutions, then we would have a set of agreeable things that would be doable and durable, that would be accepted. So we held this workshop to learn about that method, why we might want to use that, what it can get us in the end, how it's been successful, and then talk specifically about its application to the work that we're doing, to the flood sediment drought work. So we took some time there to develop a framework and some communications messages. So we took time to think about who are the affected interests, whether they're directly affected by the work, indirectly affected by the work, they're not directed, but they're involved in decision making, so like congressional members, or they aren't affected, but they might just want to get into your business, as they call it. So maybe that's press from a different part of the country or something like that. They want to interject, they want to be involved in the work. And it's just important to know who those audiences are, where they're coming from, and how we engage with them and talk to them about the things that are important to them. So it's really just to get to know, the different people who want to be involved in organizations. So again, what is important to them? We talked quite a bit about that. And then how do we build credibility with them? It's not only just accepting and realizing why we're trying to do the process that we're trying to do and gaining consent into that, but why are the states engaged in this work? And why is that important that they're engaging on this as a 5-state collaborative? Why is the Corps involved in this work? What is their authority and how does that work? And so that's how this communications framework is meant to work. And it's meant to be how we employ things in the rest of this PIS. So again, just really quick about the SDIC. So there's 15 objectives that are related to responsibility. So are we doing the work in a responsible way? Are the outcomes responsible? Are we responsiveness to our stakeholders and to the problems that our stakeholders are seeing and dealing with? And are the solutions effective, and are we effective in our process and communications? And there's 75 different techniques for doing that, but really that's meant to get to know our audience and how best we engage with them. So one of the techniques that rose out based on who our audience is and how we want to engage with them is that open forum meeting. So we did use that. We also have been collaborating with groups like this and trying to connect with groups like this to share information and reach a wider audience, and then just direct connection with each PAI we've been trying to do too. So planning assistance to the states, that brings us to this point. The way that the Corps works and the way that the states work, we wanted to create a partnership for how we would move the needle on this conversation. And while we had been requesting that larger planning authority called the Section 729 Planning Authority for long-term planning, we realized that we needed a more detailed scope around that and some work to do to even just start the conversations that we wanted to have with our stakeholders. So what the PAS authority is, the states or tribes can request a planning partnership with the Corps, where the Corps would provide technical and planning expertise. It's a 50-50 cost share. It can be matched by in-kind. So for our states, UMRBA plus our 5 states entered into that, and we've all been a part of this planning process with the Corps 50-50 along the way. It's important to note that the actions do not bind the Corps or any agency or anything like that. It doesn't bind it, but it does provide recommendations for how we should be working. So it doesn't result in an authorized action that would come from Congress. It's a bit nuanced that way, but just to set some expectations around that. And these plans often serve as the basis for sponsors, whether that's a state, group of states, or tribes in their planning decisions. So with that, UMRBA state members came together to put together a scope that we proposed to the Corps that would advance our partnerships. And it involved 3 major things. So one, we recognize that long-term planning takes a while, but there's work that we can be doing right now to make our lives better and to feed into that longer-term planning. So there's ways we can solve more straightforward problems, and Paul will get into that in a moment, but that we can start working on right now. It may not involve things that we can do, like, if we're asking for an information source, we may not get that information source right away. That may not be an immediate thing, but we know that we would need that information source. And so we can start to advocate for that or start to put together scopes of work to get that done, that kind of stuff. We also then wanted to develop that more detailed proposal for that longer term planning. So our states knew what we were signing up for. The administration, the federal administration, knew what we were trying to ask for in budget requests or Congress, et cetera, and our stakeholders. And then also this point of throughout the development of both of those 2 pieces, creating stronger collaboration through that engagement strategy. So the way we see the opportunity for the PAS, we can start to unite people towards a common vision. We can unify ourselves around some more immediate actions, and we can really start to plan for the future. So here I will turn it over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. I guess how I had to come into this presentation due to some security issues on my computer, there is about a 20-second delay on my end from what I'm seeing, but I'm going to work off the notes in front of me, and hopefully that won't cause too many problems. So first off the front, the report's going to be titled Keys to the River, and where did that title come from, or why they happened? And really where that came from was because of these listening sessions that we had as part of this effort, which I'll get into a little further. We heard people say, repeatedly, the key to this is that, the key to this problem is this, the key solution is this. So people just kept using that term keys. So, that's how that translated over into this specific report because it's a term that we heard continually throughout the process. What you're going to see from this report, it's not going to be traditional to a core developed report, and that's really the UMRBA. They wanted to do something different. They know we need to do something different in order to try to achieve solutions and other things, and so they laid this out, the report, a little bit different, and really led how the layout to an extent was going to be. And so, there's going to be an executive summary, then there's going to be a section on a collective charge, which talks about, how will we all fit in this together? What are our individual responsibilities? What are our collective responsibilities? And I think that piece is really important, because as we look at the integrated nature of the river, collectively, we all have a responsibility, in finding the solutions. So that was that front part. Then it's going to get into chapter 1, which lays out, similar to how we're doing the presentation today, which we had, the process, how did we get where we're at, and the SDIC method to show how we came to these solutions. And then chapter 2, which will be high leverage actions, and I'll explain that term a little bit further down. And then, we'll put section 729 proposal, or, but what sort of questions, maybe we can't answer today, but will be necessary to move forward if and when an additional planning study may be authorized. And then finally, in alternative actions. So throughout this whole process, we've heard so many great ideas from people. A lot of information was shared from, local community members to agencies and states, whatnot, but not everything was able to be carried through at this time. They either didn't have that consensus at the moment, or or there was just something preventing it from carrying forward as one of those immediate actions. But it is something that needs to be carried forward through any sort of future study or future work that's done, regardless of who does it. And then we have various appendices. So there's going to be a geographic setting, which just lays out the area and the history of how it came to be. Some socio-political context, in terms of governance structure and who does what. Or there was just something. Oh, sorry about that. And then some outcomes from the summit in 2017, Kirsten spoke about, and then the planning bulletin for the 729 authority. So, if that study goes forward, what people can expect from that. Next slide, please. So the study itself, one thing that's there is it tries to integrate the water resources and the actions that are happening on the river, because they really are interrelated. So, whether you have a high water event or a low water event or sediment movement, one way or another, all those pieces are connected. And so it really takes the integrated look at that. I talk to our dredging community practice all the time, and I said, hey, how does high water really affect the sediment and what we have to do for dredging? And they said, well, every time we have a high water event, it resets the system. So, when you reset the system, you're starting over again. So it really wants to focus. So we really need to focus on the integrated nature of all of this, because you can't really do one thing without it affecting the other. So, but to say, putting together this report, it is not without its challenges. And, the first thing is, we don't just want another study, and the UMRBA really has been adamant about this, that is just a planning to plan piece. I think it is really important that it lays out, specific actions that we can take now to keep moving the needle forward. We understand there's this long-term picture, but what can we do at this moment? The second thing, language barriers. There is so, over the years, there has been so many buzzwords and so many things that have been defined one way or another on the river to mean different things. So, when a word is used in the report, is it plain language or is it meant to drive something else? Resilience is an example of this. Resilience means different things to different people. Even several years ago, the Corps came out with our own definition of resilience. So when you see that term in this report, to make sure people understand what is meant when those terms are used. Another challenge we had was, just the connecting remotely. COVID-19 played a major part in this, in a delay. I'm sure there's frustrations because we had this momentum and we were moving forward. We had the listening sessions, and then we had, an additional engagement, and then we had follow-up meetings. And then it seems like we stopped there, and really that's because, with the pandemic, resources had to be moved within the state and other things. So there was a delay, but it's back up and going, and re-engagement will be happening soon in terms of sharing this, and then making sure we still have the right forums in order to do this so voices are heard. And then balancing a PAS from a Section 729 authority, as Kirsten said, the UMRBA's original request was for this larger Section 729 authority, which at this point has not been, money has not been appropriated for this specific action at the moment. But, they did have this a request and worked with the Corps for this separate action, this planning assistance to states action to keep the needle moving. And so, but really understanding that what we're doing with the PAS is its own authority. And, if and when a 729 authority is funded, then that's going to follow its own specific process. It is not the same as the PAS process. So just being clear about that. So, and then, avoiding advocating. And I apologize, my screen just went blank, but I'm going to keep going, and Kirsten, just let me know if for some reason I'm off. The Corps is not an advocacy group. We are not allowed to, nor would we want to. And so, we need to make sure that that's clear, that this is not the Corps advocating for anything. This report was a combination of what we heard and what was out there, and what the stakeholders and the affected interests would like to see and hear, and what they're saying. So the language in the report that was used, we hope there's an emphasis on fostering the collaboration and partnerships that have occurred, that people hear their own voice throughout this, that they understand, as we said before, that there's a collective responsibility. And then, this high leverage action piece, which is really the nuts and bolts of or a big portion of what we did here, one of the main tasks, talking about things we can do right now, and pieces that do not, there's little dissent on. In general, the groups and the people who participated did not have a strong point of view one way or another, but realized that, hey, this is an important thing to do, and so has that regional consent. So next slide, please. So chapter 1 dives into the FDIC method and application to our work. So as Kirsten was saying before, this FDIC method is something that, the UMRBA was a strong proponent of, because they recognized, hey, this is time to do something different. How do we get all these various stakeholders, together, speaking with each other, making sure we're communicating clearly in a safe environment, and, building off of that framework from 2018 and getting behind it. There was a determination that the FDIC method was the best process to move forward on. So how the FDIC or this informed consent was built and continues to be built on this. I mean, first we had these 6 open sessions, and I'll show in a few slides from now which open sessions there were, and they were basically from the north to the south. They started in Winona and then went all the way down to Cape Girardeau. So that was really where the first time where our PAIs could come together and speak to each other. And I'll share how they set the agenda for that. But then, after these sessions ended, the conversation does not end. And that's really the point. So, with the FDIC process, so there was, briefings throughout. You may have heard it being spoken about the quarterly meetings. MRTCI came and provided their brief and other things of how they view the watershed, and all the people who are part of this continued to listen on that. And then, we want to have direct engagements with the stakeholders. So, we hope stakeholders and people who are interested can contact, Kirsten, myself, other people, leadership in the Corps, if they have concerns or want to discuss something. And that is all, it's a lot of information, but we hope it is wrapped up in here, and you hear that throughout the document, that it is being recognized that there's more forums than just these 6 open sessions, which have led to this. And that's part of being about transparent in the development of the process. We know there was a delay right now, but with the COVID piece, and we're about to, bring back the stakeholder review on a draft report here in the very near future. So, but along the whole way, we wanted to be transparent. Hey, here's the process. Here's who participated, here's other areas to participate, here's different avenues, and just make sure that, nobody was excluded, on our end. And so, and we've done this through various ways, as I said, with the briefings, the meetings. UMRBA put together a survey to try to reach more people, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The summaries have been posted out on a public website, and there will be a link to that. The Corps had a website, which I thought was pretty neat, where we went in and you could actually, geographically click your location and provide, so GIS based, and then provide your comments if you couldn't make it to the open sessions. And really, we want this to be open-ended. It doesn't close. Even after this report is finalized, it is not a closed process. And I think that's important when you recognize this from the SDIC perspective. So next slide. So there's going to be a series of slides here, which were pictures from a video that talks about these open space sessions we had. And so the first one you'll see, this talks about how the SDIC method is supposed to be different. So the picture on the left shows a group of people who would be in a normal listening session, who would be drowsy and sleepy and maybe listening to the Corps speak about something, or the UMRBA speak about something, to what the SDIC method is supposed to do, be this in engagement. Because what the people who developed this found was, some of the best discussions that happened were when everyone was having lunch together, where they were able to speak freely. So we wanted to have a safe environment where that existed. Everyone could speak freely, learn from each other, because at the end of the day, there is so much information locally, nationally, and we all need to learn from each other. And we didn't want there to be just one leader. We wanted everyone to be a participant, and everyone their own leader, and share their thoughts. So next slide. So how this worked was, we convened, we explained what the SDIC, you add an open session if you came to one, and you'd see this take place. If you didn't, this is in general how it worked. So, come together, we explain what the SDIC process is, and then we ask those to participate to actually set the agenda, to say, hey, what do you want to talk about? And they went around the room and people raised their hand and said, I want to talk to others about this. I want to talk to others about that. And all those different topics were then put on a wall, a large wall. And then it went and we organized those topics to see where there were similarities, or were they distinct enough that it was its own separate session area to work, and said, okay, these are going to be the various topics that are going to be discussed now. So we can go to the next slide, please. So from there, now we have this big wall up here, and it says, all right, here's the agenda, here are the topics, and that's called the marketplace. And so then from the marketplace, those who participate decide which conversation they want to take place in, and once you get into one of these conversations, you can stay and talk more about it. You can leave if you don't if you don't find it interesting anymore, you can leave the whole forum if you want. You're not locked into anything. So we did see multiple people participate in various one of these topics and listening sessions, and then, or I shouldn't say listening sessions, I should say communication sessions or discussions. And so, within these discussions, there were no rules. There was just merely people speaking to each other, and then there was a note taker. And the note taker was volunteered typically, and the team agreed. And then those notes were what was discussed. That's what came out of it. So, some notes were better than others, just depending on the quality of the note taker. I will say, that gives us this raw data, but I don't think it truly captured the experience of what happened in these listening sessions. I know in the ones I participated in, I heard some great discussion happening. I saw some, real perspective coming out based on people's own experiences and emotions, and I don't think that's ever captured well. But I do think in terms of the participants who were at these, it did stick with them and resonated with them as they move forward throughout this process. So next slide, please. So then following these listening sessions, all these notes and everything were put together. There's sort of this raw data report, which again I will link to in a minute. And then, we went through. We looked at the notes. We had our teams who participated in this, and the people who participated look at the notes, find a commonality, go through these things, and really try to carry forward what information was presented at these particular events. So next slide. So here's a list of the dates and the locations in which these topics took place. As I said, the furthest one north was Winona, and then the furthest south was Cape Girardeau. So go to the next slide. These are just two pictures, as a example of those that participated. These were two of our larger group discussions. Again, I keep calling them listening sessions, and that's for those who. I apologize for that. For the core, the UMRBA, we were there to listen. We were there to understand. We did not direct these conversations. For those participating in it, the goal was to view it as a discussion, to have you discuss the topics and the information you wanted to discuss. So again, if I say listening session, that is from a core's perspective. We were there to listen, but was not necessarily overall intent. It was for the discussion. So you can see there was quite a bit of turnout. Not everyone had as many people, which was okay. Even the ones that had less. I think one of the ones I participated in only had 10 people, but it didn't limit the quality of the conversation, in my opinion. I thought the people who participated in those were passionate about what they wanted to speak about, and provided good perspective. And out of, even with the smaller ones, there wasn't a lot of redundant perspective. There was varying groups. There was recreationalists, there was academics, there was folks from different agencies, cities. There was commercial fishermen in the one I participated in. So, even only having 9 people, we probably had, 7 or 8 different, stakeholder perspectives provided from that. So next slide. So from these listening sessions, there were definitely themes that were brought forward, which are brought forward in chapter 1 of this, and even Kirsten to some extent, mentioned that. The river is behaving differently in the last 5 years than people who live on the river are, have experienced traditionally. So, maybe we don't have the academic papers that specifically quantify how everything has changed at the moment, or the studies that do that, but they're definitely at least a common theme that, hey, everyone thinks that a change is happening, and then the other piece, the status quo, and we'll use the term river management loosely, whether it be formally or informally, is just, not currently acceptable. There needs to be a new approach to maybe how we're working and living and doing things on the river, and even discussions about how this greater watershed influences things. I mean, that was really, really common. I remember one thing in the listening or the discussions that struck me was, one person just talked about what hurts them most, and this was an agricultural person, is just the lack of predictability. How do you make sound decisions if you don't know how things are going to be continually? So I think, that's an important piece in terms of, river management and approaches taking. How do we capture that sort of predictability piece so people can make the right decisions for them or a larger group? There was recognition that, hey, solutions are complex. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's going to require many considerations to be considered, and there's a lot of uses and values to the river itself, and its floodplain. Mentioned previously, flooding, drought, and sedimentation are interrelated. I think that overall integrated water resource approach, which is a term that the Corps uses a lot, how everything with water is integrated. There was general agreement on that. We heard that time and time again. There's a recognition of, it's not just a human dimension on the river itself. There's this habitat and wildlife component, and that needs to be considered because changes could inadvertently affect those. And there's recognition of that. And at the same time, high quality habitat and other things can provide, can influence and provide things on a human dimension as well. And then, the further discussion is this is not just solve the problem within the river itself. The river is a reflection of the watershed, and that, work does need to be done within the watershed to have, that long-term way, many years down the road perspective on this. So next slide. So this here is, we want to do this for if these presentations go out. Here is the link to the UMRBA website, and this has the raw data, and you can see the notes that were discussed, and you can go in and read those. They're verbatim from what the note taker took, and you can make your own interpretations from those. But again, the only thing I would caution about is, a lot of these things don't have the maybe all the context the raw data does, or the raw data doesn't have all the context of if you actually participated there, but you can see at least some of the common words and themes. So next slide, please. One thing, I'm speaking a lot, and this is taking a lot of time, but the chapters in the report itself is meant to be concise and a snapshot of this. So I do promise this is not a 100-page document when you go to review it, but there is a lot to this story. So that's why we are going into some detail here, because at least from my perspective, it is interesting, and these details are important. So, other common things we saw from the listening sessions were, there wasn't necessarily solutions given that everyone agreed to. I think there was mixed views on what solutions were right. There was, hey, this is a possible solution. Yeah, it is, but maybe we need to understand this more, or this one, maybe we understand this more. So there really isn't, I would say that informed consent at the moment on the solution set. Another thing we heard, or let's just say a misconception, and that's not really the right term, but still, not everyone understood exactly how, the river is managed, how the watershed is managed and by whom. There's a lot of different agencies, there's a lot of different groups, and, we heard, for example, with the dams, we heard discussions, one of them, well, the dams hold back floodwater on the Mississippi River, which they don't. They're run of the river structures that just match the inflows and that are coming into the outflows. So they don't affect flooding, but there still is that misconception that is happening with those. They're not like our other reservoirs. We noticed language is key. I briefly touched on that before when we were trying to decide the correct language for the report, but even more so, different terms have different meanings. Flood fighting was one that was brought up. Some people think of flood fighting as, ensuring, this area does not get inundated with water. So you might erect temporary barriers, whether that be around cities or buildings, or maybe raise a portion of a levee or extend one. While other people view flood fighting as, trying to prevent, the existing infrastructure from failing. So it might be making existing wall, more robust behind it, or preventing sand boils from occurring, or, making sure that your pump station can keep up or add more by adding additional pumps. So there's definitely different meanings to what flood fighting means, both from a legal standpoint and then just from a local or an individual perspective. And the other interesting thing we found was that public perception changes as the river moves north from the south. And, in the northern meetings, specifically Winona and Dubuque, there was a lot more focus on the multi-purpose management of the river. And, I don't know if that's because, starting in Princeton, Iowa, we have the Upper Mississippi River Wildlife or Refuge System. I don't know if that plays into it and people are just more familiar with that aspect of it, versus as you move down the river and it is more levied and you have more communities that are along the river itself, that the tone of those meetings changed quite a bit to, what is the cost of flooding on our communities? What is, we're constantly in a response mode, how is that factored into this? Flood fighting was the definition, as I mentioned before. And then, then there was that other group that maybe wasn't focused on flooding at all, that participated in this, because this is a three report. And I would say that they were equally distributed throughout, but we're concerned about, drought, and then another big piece, sediment as a whole. How does that affect things such as industry, sediment and recreation was a big talking point. A lot of recreationalists, see dredge disposal sites as beaches and places to hang out, or areas to camp. And what does that mean when one is no longer being used, or is changing, or is becoming more full, and other things. So it really was a varying perspective up and down, and it did change as we moved from north to south. Next slide. So then, within these, I spoke briefly about, some common understandings of the river, then some common challenges, but there was also common themes, terms we heard quite a bit throughout these meetings, and those ultimately became the agenda topics, which were pretty much the same throughout. So these very agenda topics, one was flowing water, how storage, what sort of storage would there be? Floodplain restoration was another one, spillways, buyouts, the Iowa watershed approach was discussed, agricultural conservation practices, and I'm not going to read all these to you, but, all these were just common topics and discussions and that happened throughout almost each one of these listening sessions. So then, next slide. So as mentioned previously, you know, we recognize, I just spent a lot of time talking about the listening sessions because that was one of the key elements of this PAS study, but, you know, the UMRBA has been adamant about this needs to be inclusive, and they, you know, are trying through every avenue to reach as many people as possible, because they recognize, hey, you know, not everyone could participate in these meetings or discussions, and, you know, or maybe you know, or maybe they just didn't even feel comfortable participating in it for various reasons. So, you know, one thing that they did after a few of these was they also developed and created a survey, which was sent out through them. And they got some additional feedback from that. And so, you know, 7 of the 10 respondents to that survey were not even people who the original email went out to. So I think, you know, every time this is spoken about, every time there's another engagement, as this demonstrates, you know, new audiences are reached, and just another opportunity for engagement. Next slide. And so, you know, we talked a lot about here and how we got to where we're at, because this was a discussion about the planning process. But this next slide is just a sneak peek at what is in the draft in terms of those high leverage actions, in terms of things that you know, generally most people support us working forward and moving towards. And what you'll see here is those things that we can work on right now, you know, are often focused on what sort of data and information and things can we be doing right now, recognizing that they're either going to help long-term planning, or, you know, our actions that can have an immediate impact on what we do every day. So on the flood front, you know, remember there's flood, drought, sediment, and watershed. So for flooding, the first one was develop floodplain model for the upper Mississippi River. And so, you know, this was an interesting one, because this was something that was identified early as a need. And actually the Corps was funded last year to produce on the upper Miss the AGC RAS floodplain model. So we were funded at least on the main stem Mississippi. So now we have that from on the entire upper Miss. And then this year we received funding to develop this model for the Illinois River. So that's going to be in the report, but you know, this directly contributed and showed support to that. So that's good. So some actions are already underway, and I think that's important to emphasize, that this is not just a plan to plan. So we will now have, you know, in the next 15 months or so, that complete model for floodplain, so we can evaluate how changes in the floodplain may affect various things. There's a recognition that the flow frequency profiles need to be updated. You know, the data we're using now under the old flow frequency study, I believe ended essentially in, I think it was 1998. So, you know, since then we've had multiple floods of record on both the on the Mississippi River, on some of the tributaries and other things. So, you know, that's 20 plus years of data that's not being incorporated into those current profiles. So there's definitely support and a need to update those, so we're talking the same language. And then there needs to be an economic vulnerability assessment. So, you know, what is truly being impacted by this? And there is discussion that, and what we try to capture is it's more than just, you know, standard traditional look at, you know, benefit to cost, or only looking at improved property. You know, what are the true economic vulnerabilities? You know, what happens if this road is no longer in use? You know, what are the community impacts? What are the agricultural impacts? You know, all those things. You know, what truly is the economic vulnerability in the current floodplain, and make sure we're capturing all perspectives. You know, drought. This one, you'll see, was not spoke about as much, but I would say, you know, to the states and agencies that participated, drought is very important. And the reason is, you know, that's one of those things which we haven't had for a long time. So as you look at, like the Dust Bowl era. What would happen if we entered into a long-term systemic drought for several years? So the first is, defining drought, because as many things, there's different jargon. So what is truly meant when we say drought? Then to look for interstate cooperation, because just like floods and other things that do not care about political boundaries, neither does drought. So make sure we have a framework for that. And then, again, that economic vulnerability assessment on drought. We've traditionally been water rich, but what sort of stuff would be impacted if we saw flows or other things we weren't anticipating? Then on sediment, this was a really, really important topic. A lot of varying discussions on this. So, one thing is there's an existing set of plans and agreements and permitting actions in place, and I think that existing framework is something that needs to be looked at and discussed further, and how that can be improved. That was something that the team spoke about and was recognized as important. Dredged material, we're starting to see there's a lot more markets that maybe this material is useful. So what sort of marketing could be done to get that material in and out of the floodplain? Because, as it related, less capacity, higher floods. So, the flood, people who are more concerned about flood, supported that sort of effort. Navigation, how do we make sure, the river stays open and support for navigation? So, is there a way to get this material out and moved around? So marketing of dredge material, and then beneficial use of dredge sediment. And I think that's something that there's a specific term that the Corps has and definitions for that. There's things that, other partners would like to see included in that, so how do we really define what beneficial use is, and how can that be incorporated into the future, and how can that discussion continue on, and make sure that we truly understand what are the benefits of dredge material where we place them. And then finally, there were all these discussions that were more watershed driven and didn't fit in these specific three topics of flood, drought, and sediment. And those had to do with better prediction models for precipitation, climate change, whatever you'd like to call it, but make sure that we're capturing that properly. So any sort of, and get agreement on that, because any sort of future planning needs to have make sure we understand what the future is like, not just the status quo. Then watershed actions, make sure that the states and other things who have primary responsibility within the watersheds are being clear upfront and communicating effectively what they're doing, in terms of, their nutrient reduction programs, and then, their support for development of ponds and controlling runoff and other things. So that needs to be further developed by the states, and there just seem to be broad support from that. And then finally, making sure that we have the appropriate forum to continue to share information, because there's so many people doing great work within the river, or just gaining knowledge about the river and the watershed as a whole, making sure that platform exists to continue that information exchange from all of those participants, whether it be locally, at a city level, at a collegiate level, or an agency level, whatever it's at, just making sure we're all sharing openly and freely that information. So with that being said, I'm going to have Kirsten, and sorry that was kind of long. It's something we've worked a long time on this about, so there's a lot, and I assume more questions, but at this point there's a chapter 3 which talks about long-term planning, and that's something I'm going to have Kirsten speak about at this time.
Thanks, Paul. And for just a moment, I'm going to take a little liberty and go into that watershed action, and do a plug for UMRBA's legislation that we are hoping to ramp up this next year to bring in federal investment into nutrient reduction strategies. If you've been looking at the formalization of a water subcabinet, the federal support for states' implementation of the nutrient reduction strategies is listed, along with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and South Florida Everglades, and so it gives us a big opportunity to suggest that that funding should follow that, so we can make some real progress there. So that is also included in the report.
And I will add that that is the UMRBA's.
That is the UMRBA, not where we can advocate for things. So that's what we are doing. Thank you, Paul. And so anyway, so chapter three, getting into the long-term planning. So what did we learn? We learned status quo, and I'll be quick about this because we want to be mindful of your all's time, but status quo is not acceptable or accepted. We need a call for change. We all recognize that this call for change is reasonable, right, and needed, and that's what's bringing us all to the table. But if we are to build resilience, in the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program had just explored this question. We're looking at what are we building resilience of, to what, and for what purposes, and that's going to be a very hard question for us to answer. But when the states are looking at resilience, that's what we're looking for. So I will also just take this moment to underscore Paul's note that federal agencies cannot advocate. And so for this part of the report going forward, this is UMRBA's proposal. So this is how we are talking about resilience and thinking about it. So for example, where should existing land uses be protected? That was a question that we've heard from our stakeholders. And how should it be protected? Where should they be changed and how? So the change might just be what certain stakeholders are proposing levee districts of taking on water, that quote unquote taking on water. It could be things like that. It's an open-ended question, but they are serious questions that we need to answer if we are going to build resilience in the system. So what is this Section 729 authority? It allows us to evaluate a series of strategies, alternatives, actions within a watershed context. We can take a core project, or the Corps can look at its planning in a watershed context. We realize we need to do that rather than base our management strategies on historic assumptions of how the river is managed and how tributaries influence the system. And we also can look at that in this authority, look at a broad range of stakeholders' authorities. So look at what the states are doing, what local governments are doing, levee districts, and think about all of this in a comprehensive light. So one of our first steps in terms of the Corps' planning scenario is to, and this how the Section 729 unfolds, is to really examine what our existing conditions are and what our future without intervention would be. So what is the trajectory or the likely trends of tributary inputs of water and sediment long term? Or what's our ability and our capacity to place dredge material? Things like that. What are some assumptions that we can have about our planning scenario if we were not to do anything about it? That's our first major step. What we do know, what we can say, is that water and sediment flow and the rate is greater. It's exceeding our capacity at which we are currently able to manage it effectively, efficiently, in a strategic way, not in an emergency response mode. We know that droughts may result in significant vulnerabilities. So while the Dust Bowl was behind, we also had the 2012 drought. We had the 2018 drought in Missouri that was pretty significant, where water supply nearly ran out in a community, but also affected others. And we've had other drought scenarios. And one thing, especially that we're hearing from NOAA, is that this rapid change between flood and drought conditions is particularly challenging for the upper Midwest and for the upper Mississippi River in particular. And that's where our real vulnerability is. And that's a major reason for why we want to put high water, low water, flood, drought together, but also that they affect sediment distribution. And that's also a major problem for ours. So defining existing conditions and the future without major intervention. Some of the bigger questions that we got throughout, after those listening sessions, we also had various workshops. And things we heard in those conversations too, as well as other engagements, again, are, what's really causing these increasing trends? If we need to get at the root cause, what's causing them, both within the watershed, maybe, and within the floodplain. But how much is attributed to land use? What tributaries are more acutely affected by climate change or precipitation? Which tributaries have the greatest impact on the river's resilience? What impacts might result from low flows through the entire system, including water quality degradation? Continuing on that, let's describe flood conveyance issues. We heard from stakeholders understanding that, it's levee height here, levee height there, and the mixture of when they were authorized and what assumptions they were based on. Also, where storage is at, how sediment is impacting or filling in backwaters and how that's maybe impacting flood conveyance. So just getting a better sense of that. What triggers cause a demand for water to exceed its availability? So basically, how does drought unfold in the upper Miss? And how do we know when that's happening? What can we look for to predict when it's going to happen so we're more prepared? The problems that are affecting sediment management and the economic and social vulnerabilities. So we'll use some of those actions in the in chapter 2, like Paul had said, to inform some of this. Describe the recent performance of flood protection infrastructure and storage areas. Are they working? Where aren't they working? Where are they degraded? What's the, their state? And then describe the barriers to implementing solutions, including we heard a lot about how does the multi-jurisdictional governance on the Upper Miss contribute to the challenges. So that should help us set the course for then defining what do we want out of our future and how do we go about making the change that we would want. How should and can the floodplain be altered to allow for effective conveyance of floods and deposition of sediment? And how should we prepare or mitigate for prolonged droughts? So as Paul said, review is coming soon. Please look for that. Carol, if you could help us distribute that to your network. As for UMRBA, we can at least acknowledge some steps that our board has agreed to. So we want to continue, we want to build a work plan that suggests, near term, like how we lay out and sequence our steps, but we would like to advance those action related items and really be serious about that with some immediate next steps. Obviously, we would advocate for authorization and appropriations that go not along just with the study, but also those key action items. Develop branding. So we recognize that it's been hard to follow along. We've really been true to that systematic development of informed consent model where we're really trying to hear from the language that's used by our stakeholders, what resonates, and how we should unfold this process working with our stakeholders. So that's allowed things to unfold. We also have the PIS, the Section 729 study, all within this context of long-term planning. And then the actions that fit in with that. So we want to develop some sort of branding so that it's easier for our the affected interests, the people, communities to follow along with what UMRBA is doing and what the Corps is doing. And then we want to convene discussions around climate science a little bit more immediately. So there is what's called Atlas 14, which you may or may not be familiar with. But as National Weather Service says, the way that precipitation events are happening are different. So for example, whereas we historically would get, the Upper Miss Basin would historically get localized rainfall events, we're now getting events that span the watershed and that involve large rainfall events. So 6 inches like everywhere throughout the watershed. And that's what's really feeding, I think, that the floodplain differently and what's causing some of our challenges. And so National Weather Service suggests that there may be a new science that we need to do some long range scenario planning and assumptions about precipitations. So that's where we're at. Also, the states have a lot of information about what is going on in the watershed, what is challenging, and so we would take it upon ourselves to pull that together to help inform this long-term planning with the Corps. So with that, Paul and my contact information is provided on here. You are free to contact us individually after this, but I guess, Carol, maybe now is time for questions. Thank you for your patience as we ran a little bit long.
Great presentation, thank you. And for our attendees, again, you can type your questions into the chat box on the right-hand side. And I'm sure Kirsten and Paul would love to answer them. And I've got a question, couple actually. The HEC RAS floodplain model, what's that acronym stand for?
I should know this off the top of my head. It is Hydrologic Engineering Centers. Let me just make sure I'm not butchering this. I will get you that answer.
Okay.
I'm so used to just using it by the acronym. So, Hydrologic Engineering Center River Analysis System.
Okay. All right. I know I've seen it, but I couldn't recall it myself. And earlier during the presentation, someone asked about SDIC, which I was able to type in what that stands for. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more, Kirsten.
Yeah, so that's what we kind of went into length about. That's the systematic development of informed consent. It is a theory that was developed by Hans Bleicher, and you can Google it to learn a little bit more. But basically, the crux of it is that our stakeholders, especially those that are directly affected and are aware of what's going on or knowledgeable of what's going on, and ultimately have consent, so that we don't have opposition in the end that will stop the ideas from going forward.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess on a generic level, they're from a planning practice, there's a lot of different ways to go about doing planning and different methodologies, and so it is a specific method with in a specific way of doing a planning process.
Okay. And I found it interesting that that there were such differences between the opinions in the north end of the river versus the south of the Upper Miss, I guess it would be. Was there any correlation to the number of people that came to these sessions?
No, so this is Kirsten. I was at all 6. I think, while we spoke more about the differences, I think there were far more similarities in the discussion, actually, which was probably most interesting. The difference, I think, in perspective was that in the northern meetings, they talked more so about what's going on inside of the river. And that might be a characteristic of how the floodplain, unfolds as it goes from north to south. And also, like Paul had said, the refuge system. But further south, I think it was more, how is the river affecting the floodplain? How is it coming outside of its banks? And I think partly that's a product of communities in those areas constantly flood fighting. So they talked about community-based systems for flood fighting, which the northern parts of the system don't experience as much or in the same way. But I think, in terms of the rivers acting differently, needing to look in the tributaries, needing to understand precipitation change long term and make some assumptions about that, change in our management, definitely misunderstandings in how the river is managed. Those things were all common. And as Paul said, the agendas were actually pretty similar as you move north to south because the topics were similar and the questions were similar.
Okay. Well, good. And one more for me. I think early on, I can't remember if it was you or Paul that mentioned the coordination or collaboration with other organizations, including America's Watershed Initiative. And can you talk about what kind of collaboration? I mean, were they part of your planning group, or how did they fit in?
So this is Kirsten again, and I'll just answer that because I serve on the board of the America's Watershed Initiative. So that line was meant to suggest we have conversations with members that serve on America's Watershed Initiative board. And we talk about what America's Watershed Initiative is doing, like its upcoming report card release, so look for that, and how we could use that to talk about the work we need to do with flood sediment drought planning. but also just get input that way. So, with MRCTI's meetings, the mayor's groups, the times that they've spoken at the quarterly meetings, I guess the idea there is that we have been hearing from our stakeholders for a long time, and all of that should be integrated in the report, integrated into the tone, the language we're considering, et cetera.
Okay.
Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
Well,
Sorry.
yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add to that is, the intent is never to exclude anybody, so whether or not there was, and I guess that's what I was trying to emphasize was, whether or not somebody physically was at one of these meetings or participated or not for various reasons, the door is always open for everyone. And, there are these common groups who, are more known, and they definitely have been active and participated, but there's so many diverse groups and stakeholders and potentially affected interests, even from, individuals who are affected differently. And I just want to emphasize that the door was and is open for everyone to participate and provide their information.
And that's actually, it makes a lot of sense, just, getting everybody on board so that, you're not living in silos, you're communicating across and not all chasing the same things at the same time. And Kirsten, you mentioned the river report card and that it might be coming out soon. When do you expect that?
Well, let's actually look at my email that just came out that said that. I wish. It will be coming out the week of December 3rd, so later in that week.
Great, because as I'm sure you know, at the Upper Mississippi River Conference, we have tried to key in on various aspects of where those grades came from the first time around, and in hopes of making some positive changes every 5 years as it's being reevaluated. So we're interested to see what that looks like. So, and I don't see any more questions, so last chance for our audience to quickly type away. But I would like to thank Kirsten and Paul very much for agreeing to do a presentation for us today. I remembered hearing about these listening sessions and communication sessions last year, and it's good to hear what happened and what's coming out of those. And it sounds like lots more work to be done, but there's some direction and buy-in, and that's obviously very important. So with that, we are going to wrap up our webinar series, and this webinar in particular. Oh, wait, we've got a question. From Ed Freer, are there more storage opportunities in the lower part of the Mississippi River and impacts on flooding or lower cities? Was there a unilateral understanding of the issues regardless of the geographic location or distance from the main channel?
Well, those are great questions. Ed asked those questions. Did you say Ed? Yes. I can't see the chat box. Yeah, thank you, Ed, for your question. Those are great questions, and those are really the types of questions that we would need to assess in the longer term planning. So why we would want that Section 729 study.
Yeah, and I would add, the piece I was trying to emphasize of not just planning to plan, some of those tools that are being worked on now and had consent in terms of the, the floodplain modeling, and if we can, get an update on flow frequencies in the future, if there's an opportunity for that, those will provide us, good frameworks to start answering some of those questions.
Okay. All right. I'll give that final warning again. And thank you once again, and I thank all of our attendees. Hope they've gotten some good information and sparked some interest in helping all of these efforts in the future. So All right, well, thank you, and we'll hopefully see everyone maybe in person next fall. I've got my fingers crossed. All right, thank you and take care.